In the icy depths of Icelandic waters, Tilikum swam alongside her family, feeling the comforting familiarity of the ocean currents. The sounds of the other members of her pod echoed softly through the water, creating a web of communication that held them all together. The vast and boundless ocean was the perfect home for her. Young and energetic, with no concerns other than the natural rhythm of marine life. But one fateful day, something strange disturbed this tranquility. Out of nowhere, metallic noises invaded the crystal-clear waters, followed by the rapid movement of enormous nets. The humans had arrived. The young orca, confused, followed her mother in a desperate attempt to escape. But the nets were relentless. Surrounded, Tilikum felt panic rising. She could hear the distant screams of her relatives, also trapped, and the muffled sound of the churning water as her attempts to escape were thwarted. The hunters, driven only by profit, dragged Tilikum out of the water, her wet skin glistening in the now cruel sunlight. She was separated from her mother, her eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before she was carried away. The quiet desperation was palpable. Everything she had ever known had been ripped away, and the vast ocean where she had been free to swim seemed a distant, unreachable memory. Within days, Tilikum was placed in a cramped tank, surrounded by concrete walls, where the water was cold and sterile. The vastness of the ocean had been replaced by cruel confinement. Her new life of captivity had begun. The days in captivity became monotonous and suffocating for Tilikum. In the cold, cramped tank, her once strong and agile fins now moved heavily through the stagnant water. The freedom of the ocean grew more distant with each passing day, and the concrete walls imprisoned her, not only physically but emotionally. Other orcas shared her space, but the forced environment created tension between the animals. Their natural socialization behavior had been disrupted by the limited space and the pressure imposed by the trainers. Humans came every day. At first, Tilikum did not understand their commands, but she quickly learned that failure to obey resulted in punishment. The training was grueling. For every trick, a reward. For every mistake, deprivation of food or isolation. She jumped, flapped her fins, and clapped her tail in the water, all to entertain the crowds, who applauded without ever seeing what was going on beyond the performances. Frustration, hunger, and forced confinement began to shape his personality. Little by little, Tilikum stopped being a free and confident creature, becoming a shadow of his former self. The tank in which he lived was too small for an orca of his size, and the stress began to manifest itself physically. His dorsal fins began to fold, a clear sign of suffering among orcas in captivity. Interactions with the other orcas often ended in aggression, a result of the pressure they all felt in that inhospitable environment. But visitors only saw the impeccable performances and well-rehearsed tricks. The show continued, with no one questioning what was happening outside the public's view. Tilikum became increasingly distant, his spirit dull and his mind increasingly confused, captivated, but never tamed. After years at the first park, Tilikum was transferred to an even more famous and commercial destination, SeaWorld in the United States. The long and uncomfortable journey was only the beginning of a new phase of her imprisonment. Upon arrival, she was introduced to an environment that was larger in terms of spectacle, but no longer suitable for a creature of her size. The tank at SeaWorld was larger than the previous one,
but still small and artificial for an orca,
which would naturally travel vast distances every day in the ocean. The new routine at SeaWorld was strict. Tilikum was now part of a much larger spectacle, designed to entertain millions of tourists. Crowds packed the stands daily to watch her and other orcas perform spectacular leaps and impressive interactions with their trainers. To the audience, the show was magic. For Tilikum, it was an endless repetition of forced tricks and a life of constant confinement. Behind the scenes, her mental and physical health continued to decline. Social isolation was even more frequent, as Tilikum did not easily integrate with the group of other orcas. Loneliness, combined with the constant stress of intensive training, made her even more unpredictable. The pressure on her to perform flawlessly only increased. Over time, Tilikum stopped being just another orca among many and became one of the biggest attractions in the park. Her imposing size and the spectacular shows she performed made her a star. But behind the glamorous facade was an exhausted creature, trapped in a mechanical and meaningless routine. Her soul, which had once known freedom, was now completely swallowed up by the system that profited from her presence. The crowd cheered wildly, excited for yet another show at SeaWorld. To the spectators, this was just another grand spectacle. But for Tilikum, it was another day of exhaustion. The repetitive tricks and the expectation of constant perfection fed a cycle of frustration and despair. The confined environment and long training sessions continued to wear her down, physically and emotionally. She had spent years adapting to confinement, but now she was close to her limit. That day, something was different. The trainer who had worked with Tilikum for years seemed unaware of the change in the orca's behavior. She did not respond to commands as usual, showing signs of tension, but the performance continued. The audience applauded enthusiastically with every jump and every splash of water that hit them. The excitement was visible on everyone's faces, except Tilikum's. Then, in a moment that seemed like just another rehearsed trick, Tilikum grabbed the trainer and pulled him underwater with unexpected force. Chaos quickly ensued. People screamed, others froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. Tilikum, however, would not let go of the trainer's body, and despair took over the stage. The incident resulted in the tragic death of the trainer. The media quickly mobilized, classifying Tilikum as a killer orca. The public narrative focused on the violent death, the danger that these wild creatures posed, and the story was replayed incessantly on the news. For the public, Tilikum had become the monster that many feared. However, what few understood at the time was that this behavior was not gratuitous. Years of isolation, stress, and emotional abuse had transformed the behavior of a creature that, deep down, did not belong in this world. Tilikum's reaction was not one of malice, but of desperation, a response to the confinement and the artificial life that had been imposed on her. After the incident, the consequences were immediate. Tilikum was placed in total isolation. No-co. After the tragic incident, Tilikum was removed from the show and kept in isolation. Her tank, now even more solitary, became a reflection of her emotional state. Without the company of other orcas, and without regular interaction with her trainers, her existence was reduced to emptiness. Day after day, she swam in circles, her immense body squeezed by the limited space, her mind broken by the confinement. The muffled sound of the water was the only thing that filled the silence of her new reality. Meanwhile, the outside world began to question what had happened. Tilikum's story gained traction not only because of the tragedy, but because of what it represented. The documentary Blackfish was released, exposing to the world the deplorable conditions in which orcas like Tilikum lived in captivity. The film was a watershed moment. Millions of people watched her story and, for the first time, began to understand that the killer orca was, in fact, a victim. The pressure on SeaWorld and other marine parks began to mount. Protesters gathered outside the facility, demanding an end to the confinement of orcas. The audience, which had previously applauded without question, was now beginning to see the cruelty behind the spectacle. Tilikum, however, remained invisible, locked in her tank, away from everything. Her days were completely monotonous. The lack of physical and mental stimulation was deteriorating her health, while her spirit continued to slowly fade. Isolation was both her punishment and her torture. On the outside, the orca had become a symbol. Inside, she lived out her days in an almost ghostly existence. Time passed, and Tilikum's health deteriorated rapidly. Years of confinement, cruel isolation, and physical exhaustion took their toll. Her immense strength, once admired in shows, now felt like a burden, carried on a tired and weakened body. The trainers, who had once encouraged her to perform jumps and maneuvers, now merely watched her slow and painful decline. Tilikum's folded fins and dull eyes were a reflection of the suffering she had endured. Finally, on January 6, 2017, Tilikum passed away, alone in her tank. News of her death spread quickly around the world, but this time, instead of being remembered as the killer orca, Tilikum was seen as a martyr. Her life in captivity had exposed the serious flaws in the treatment of animals in marine parks, and her death only reinforced the need for change. Outside the parks, the fight for freedom for orcas and other marine animals only grew stronger. The documentary Blackfish, which brought Tilikum's story to light, sparked a wave of public outrage. Protests and boycotts of SeaWorld became commonplace, and pressure on the marine entertainment industry reached unprecedented levels. In response to growing opposition, SeaWorld announced in 2016 that it would end its orca breeding program and eventually discontinue performing with the animals. The orcas already in captivity would not be released, but no more would suffer the same fate as Tilikum. Tilikum's legacy has continued to inspire activists, scientists, and ordinary people who have come to understand the profound suffering that animals can endure in the name of profit and entertainment. His story has changed hearts and minds, and brought to light the ethical issues of captivity of wild animals. Although Tilikum died without ever returning to the ocean he once knew, His existence changed the world. It opened the eyes of millions to the reality of what goes on behind the walls of marine parks. The orca that had once been used as an attraction ended her life as a symbol